Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor. A week on from the federal budget, the Coalition argues the government's economic plan falls well short of what's needed to tackle things like the housing crisis and cost of living pressures. Angus Taylor with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Today we welcome the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor to reply to the Albanese government's third budget. I'd like to acknowledge that this is Mr Taylor's third appearance since the 2022 election. That's the most of anyone in the Coalition. Julian Leeser, Dan Tehan and Jacinta Price are the only other opposition shadow ministers to appear at the club since the election, and we are now less than a year from the next one. What a shame for our regular audience of several 100,000 viewers that they're missing a chance to hear an outline of first-hand of the Coalition's detailed policy positions. The club does have a standing invitation to the Leader of the Opposition, and we look forward to him accepting that in the near future. In the meantime, let's welcome Angus Taylor to the podium.
Well, thank you, Laura, and it's great to be back here at the Press Club. As you say, I've been here many times since the election and before the election, indeed, and always happy to come along. Can I also acknowledge, though, the many colleagues I have here today: Jane Hume, Michaela Cash, Perrin Davey, Dean Smith, Paul Fletcher, Sarah Henderson, James Patterson and Simon Kennedy, all of whom have been very closely involved in the development of the work that I'll outline today and the positions that the Coalition has taken, both on the budget and in our budget in reply. Recently, I visited a netball competition in the western growth areas of Sydney, a yearly highlight in my electorate. This year, however, the sidelines were quieter, the crowds thinner. When I asked why, the answer was simple but heart-wrenching. Many families can no longer afford organised sport for their children. This isn't just anecdotal. It's a trend we've seen nationally, where absolute necessities now take precedence over what were once considered normal activities. Persistent inflation and high interest rates are just numbers on the page until you see the impact. As prices and interest rates soar, the hard-earned money in people's pay packets buys less and less. Families struggle over having to cut back on simple pleasures like eating out, buying meat, heating their homes or paying for participation in kids' sport. Parents swallow their pride and make sacrifices, haunted by the fear of failing to provide for their loved ones. They work extra hours and dig deeper into savings which are the foundation of their future aspirations. At a time of uncertainty with the softening job market, families agonise over how to make ends meet if the worst should happen. A whole generation of Australians haven't experienced this until now. Aspirations like home ownership, higher education and a comfortable retirement slip away, and the cycle is self-fulfilling. Each piece of economic news and false promises from politicians erode hope, leaving families feeling trapped in a cycle of despair. But the strain doesn't stop with families. 50% of small business loans are secured against the family home. Small businesses, the backbone of our communities right across Australia, are buckling under the weight of repeated interest rate hikes, 12 since Labor came to power. This is the reality of life under Labor as Australians have become poorer. Despite being promised cheaper mortgages, cheaper power bills and a lower cost of living before the election, Australians have seen nothing of the sort. Instead, they face a reality where both hope and certainty are in short supply. Now, alongside raging inflation, Australia is in an entrenched GDP per person recession. Our standard of living has fallen by more than 7% since the last election, a collapse unprecedented and unparalleled in other advanced economies. Real wages for working households have collapsed by around 9%. Our consumer confidence remains entrenched at recessionary lows. McKinsey has labelled Australia as being in a productivity recession. The number of unemployed people and the number of people on job seeker caseload are increasing. And most alarmingly, youth unemployment is on the rise. We've seen over 16,000 businesses enter insolvency since June 2022, and The Economist has declared that Australia has the most persistent inflation of any advanced country in the world. Inflation remains stubborn because our policy settings are not right. Domestic inflation is running at more than five times imported inflation, and the RBA Governor has declared that Australia's inflation is homegrown. So, given this context of persistent inflation and a household recession, the Coalition, and was myself working very closely with Jane Hume and Peter Dutton, of course, and the economic team, called for a budget that focused on three things. First, restoring our standard of living and taming inflation by taking pressure off the prices of essentials and delivering affordable energy for families and businesses. Second, restoring a pathway to prosperity that creates opportunity for all Australians, so small businesses are rewarded for their effort and young Australians have the chance to own a home. Third, restoring budget discipline and honesty, including reintroducing the Coalition's fiscal rules, which have been in place prior to this government since the 1990s. On any assessment, this budget cannot be said to have met those tests. We've now seen three Labor budgets, three chances to make the right decisions, to focus on the right priorities. Labor's only answer has been for a big spending, big government and big Australia approach. And economists from KPMG to Deloitte, HSBC, Barrenjoey to private and public sector economists like Richard Holden, Stephen Hamilton, Warren Hogan and Judith Sloan are unanimous that Labor's approach is making the situation worse, not better. The result is homegrown inflation that has made Australians poorer. Now, whilst the budget delivered just over a week ago failed to substantively address these issues and meet these tests, there are some budget measures that we can support. In addition to the measures announced by Peter Dutton last Thursday night, including initiatives focused on dealing with domestic violence, I can confirm that we will support initiatives that we judge will make our country more prosperous and more productive. These include the establishment of a financial services regulatory grid, the proposed one-stop shop for investors, streamlined foreign investment board approvals, and the development of a regulatory regime for digital assets. For some time we've been calling for these policies, but implementation will be critical. However, when it comes to the broader measures, economists are clear, as I said, that the budget is unambiguously expansionary. Labor has committed an extra $315 billion of spending since the last election, or around $30,000 per Australian household. On policy decisions, Labor is spending $4 for every $1 raised. Government spending as a percent of GDP is forecast to be at its highest level since the mid-80s outside of the pandemic. Nominal spending is growing at 16% over the next 2 financial years. That's double the rate of economic growth. Now, Labor says this is unavoidable, but included in this spending is much that we consider to be unnecessary waste, including what you saw recently with the $450 million on the failed referendum, but billions in corporate welfare, millions in grants to the union movement, funding of anti-resource project activists, more than $85 million for spin units inside the Treasurer's Department, 36,000 additional Commonwealth public servants and $45 billion in off-budget spending that we've opposed through the Parliament. This kind of spending is only unavoidable to Labor. And despite inflation-fuelled bracket creep and some of the strongest commodity prices in Australia's history, Labor has wasted the windfall. Personal income taxes are 23% higher than when Labor came to office. The structural deficit is growing, leaving Australia vulnerable to future shocks. This is leading to growing debt and making commodity-driven surpluses look very short-term. None of this is helping to bring down inflation and interest rates. None of this is helping to boost productivity and capacity for sustainable growth. The government's position is clear. Their high inflation, low growth economy fuelled only by record population growth is someone else's fault. But that starting position is a cop-out. Not only did the government promise a cure, it now blames whoever it can. And that's because it misdiagnoses the problems and won't use the necessary tools in the toolkit to solve those problems. Now, we need a better way. In order to get Australia back on track, we need a back-to-basics economic agenda. An agenda that Peter and our team has been outlining over the last 2 years and will continue to through to the election. My colleagues Jane Hume, Michaelia Cash, Ted O'Brien and Sarah Henderson have outlined the principles that will guide our approach in their areas like deregulation, industrial relations, energy, education and others. And led by Peter, we've already announced policies that will make it easier to get a job and run a business by supporting pensioners, veterans and job seekers to work more without losing their payments. Restore the dream of home ownership by letting first home buyers and older women access super to help with the deposit, and by aligning migration and housing. Make our communities safe and secure with practical policies like banning sports betting advertisements during live sport, doubling the size of the Australian Centre to counter child exploitation, and making it illegal to glorify criminal activities online. Ensure our lights stay on, our manufacturers stay open, and we bring down power bills by investing in the gas we need now and into the future. Make it easier to see a doctor and access mental health and women's health treatment by supporting training the next generation of GPs and committing funding for endometriosis and ovarian cancer. We'll have more to say, of course, as we proceed through to the next election. But today I want to specifically focus on the Coalition's approach to fiscal policy, productivity, tax reform, along with housing, energy and industry policy. Now, a coalition government is putting productivity and per-person GDP growth at the centre of our economic strategy, because productivity is what allows higher wages without higher inflation. Higher wages without higher inflation. This allows both workers and businesses to flourish. We've already gone further than most oppositions, opposing more than $58.7 billion of Labor's new spending. Labor has no fiscal guardrails. It has abandoned the rules that supported every good budget since Peter Costello established the Charter of Budget Honesty, including putting a speed limit on taxing and spending through a tax to GDP cap and containing spending growth to less than growth in the economy. Committing to reducing debt and delivering structural surpluses over the medium term. The Coalition will restore these rules. The word productivity is hard to find in this budget. Labor has all but given up on productivity reform, and its revised assumption of 1.2% per annum average growth looks heroic against the experience of the last 2 years. Productivity, of course, has been a challenge across the world for many years, but not like we have seen in Australia in the last 2 years. The 5.4% drop in Australian labour productivity since Labor came to power is unprecedented in our lifetimes and unmatched amongst major advanced economies. The collapse in productivity makes sustainable increases in real wages, which we all want to see, all but impossible. Labor's workplace relations changes are making a bad situation worse at a time when workers want greater purchasing power in their pay packets and more flexible outcomes. It's taken the definition of a casual employee from 5 paragraphs to 3 pages with 15 to 25 steps just to employ someone as a casual. The Coalition will reverse this change. This is the start not the end of what we need to see to get productivity moving. We know productivity reform is essential to address the fiscal challenges presented by an ageing population and falling service delivery. For instance, the Productivity Commission estimates use of digital technology can deliver savings of $5.7 billion a year to the health system while providing better outcomes for consumers. But getting productivity back on track is essential because the first step of tax reform is to restrain the growth in spending. The gap between receipts and payments of $43 billion in just over a year's time is not sustainable. Of course, Labor wants to support future spending growth with never-ending bracket creep, which of course happens faster if inflation is higher. But already Australia has high rates of income tax and one of the highest company tax rates in the world. A coalition government is focused on tax reform that enhances incentives and boosts investment. Our guiding principle is that taxes should be lower, simpler and fairer. And lower taxes mean that we strive to reduce the income tax burden on families and young Australians, which also requires that governments live within their means. Simpler taxes go not just to tax design, but the complexity of the overall system, how tax is collected and how Australians interact with the ATO. Fairer taxes mean giving small businesses a fair go and ensuring we make multinationals and large companies pay their fair share of tax. By contrast, to date, Labor has shown a preference for redistribution rather than reform, and complexity over simplicity. Labor's Stage 3 changes not only broke a promise that was made over 100 times by the Prime Minister and Treasurer, they removed simplicity from our tax system. Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese are the first Treasurer and Prime Minister to add a tax bracket into law since 1993, and the first to lower the top income tax threshold since 1984. Labor's super tax change implements an unprecedented example of taxing unrealised capital gains in our tax system. But it adds complexity and inequity, unevenly and unequally taxing people on the basis of their career, their fund and their age. As a first priority, a coalition tax policy prioritises delivering for families and small businesses. Our commitment in this budget reply is to make the instant asset write-off permanent, and that's a down payment on our priority of lower, simpler, fairer taxes. This will simplify depreciation for 2.5 million small businesses across Australia, while giving them the certainty that they can plan investments on a longer-term basis rather than year to year. It builds on the Coalition's calls for Labor to restore the measure to its pre-COVID levels. It's a major commitment boosting cash flow in millions of small businesses, rewarding them for making the investment they need to grow their businesses and grow the economy. In the coming months, we'll also outline further tax reform priorities for government that we'll pursue over the medium term. Now, Australia is a proud migrant nation, and we will always remain so. But we also need to face the reality. Labor plans to bring in 1.67 million migrants over 5 years, while falling 400,000 homes short of its own target, its own promise. 1.67 million migrants is up from 1.6 at MyEFO, 1.5 at the last budget, 1.2 million from Labor's first budget, and 1.1 million when we left government. This is a government that has lost control. In just 2 years, Labor has brought in 923,000 migrants, but on the available data, there are only 265,000 new homes. This is a mathematical reality. We cannot wish our way into more housing supply. The Coalition wants Australians to be able to afford to rent and buy a home. We cannot consign people to sleeping in cars or couch surfing to get by. So to support home ownership, we have recommitted to allowing Australians to access their super to secure a housing deposit, making it easier for young couples and families to get into a house while ensuring the gains are preserved for retirement. But there is much to do to alleviate supply-side pressures. and the government is failing to shift the dial. In response, the Coalition proposes to relieve those supply-side pressures, reduce demand by first temporarily banning foreign investors and temporary residents from buying existing homes, cutting permanent migration by 25% for 2 years, followed by a gradual balancing with a great emphasis on skilled visas to support construction, and thirdly, reducing foreign student numbers in metropolitan universities to lessen rental market pressure and introduce a tiered student visa fee arrangement. This will free up well over 100,000 additional dwellings over the next 5 years and would free up substantially more if Labor were to implement the policy now. In parallel, we'll focus on enhancing productivity across the economy and in our construction industry. We've announced policies to support more people into the workforce. We've announced that our changes to visa charges will support our regional universities as well as private colleges. And the Coalition understands that housing supply is a whole of economy problem, whilst Labor is not treating it as one. Labor's billions of unnecessary spending include initiatives like thousands of kilometres of unnecessary power lines, putting pressure on demand for construction trades that will flow through to our housing market. At the same time, Labor is refusing to list construction trades on the skilled visa lists. Master Builders analysis shows that the first tranche of Labor's IR laws will cost $15.9 billion in construction output and set Labor's housing targets back by another 15,400 homes. The total impact of the subsequent changes or stages of IR reforms will be worse. Building ministers have waved through some of the biggest changes to the National Construction Code in a decade, adding to red tape and compliance burden for projects. Labor's only solution to housing is to throw around more money and more red tape. The Coalition will make the tough decisions to remove supply pressures, reduce costs and improve productivity. Now, the pressures on construction and other costs don't just apply in the housing market. Our manufacturing and resources sectors are under cost pressure, with recent losses to those sectors, including Qenos and the Kwinana alumina refinery. It's too expensive and too slow to build and operate things in Australia. The consequence is that Labor's Made in Australia policy is throwing taxpayers' money after Labor's bad policies. The Coalition wants our resources and manufacturing sectors to thrive. These are sectors I worked in throughout my career before politics, and I know their future potential is even greater than their past achievements. But getting back on track and back to basics means making Australia a great place to invest in resources and manufacturing again. Labor's handouts mean little compared to the onslaught of red tape, taxes and regulatory uncertainty Labor has imposed on these industries, limiting access to capital through changes to the sophisticated investor test, increasing costs through the safeguard mechanism, forcing up compliance costs and uncertainty through bad workplace laws, introducing ad hoc and retrospective changes to tax laws and rules, adding $2.3 billion a year in red tape for companies to update their emissions reports, including for their customers, making gas market interventions that have made it impossible for manufacturers to renegotiate natural gas contracts, and funding environmental litigation and lawfare, which is turning the flood of major project approvals to a trickle. As the BCA, MCA and ACCI have pointed out, it is death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts. Manufacturers I speak to regularly need a better business environment today, not in the future. As Industry Minister, I was proud that when we left government, there were more manufacturing businesses, more manufacturing exports, and manufacturing was a larger share of the economy than when we came to office in 2013. More investment means getting the economic fundamentals right across energy, regulation, approvals and tax. The Coalition will make Australia a better place to invest by increasing domestic natural gas production to ensure cheaper, reliable and cleaner energy, streamlining regulatory approvals and restoring the National Gas Infrastructure Plan, which Labor dropped and has refused to reinstate. And that's a plan that will fill the gap in gas supply caused by collapsing Bass Strait production. Focusing on cutting unnecessary red and green tape, particularly around approvals. This includes reducing overlap between state and federal environmental laws and unwinding the worst of Labor's inflexible workplace laws, as I outlined a little earlier. It also means securing long-term, cheap, clean power by opening the door to nuclear energy. Robert Menzies recognised the need for the Snowy Hydro scheme if Australia was to be competitive in the post-war industrial environment. Today, we need more energy, not less. If we are to secure the future capability of our manufacturing sector, that is absolutely essential. Data, AI and robotics also all require reliable baseload energy. Yet under Labor's plan, 90% of our baseload energy will leave the grid by 2035 without equivalent capacity to replace it. With 1/3 of the world's uranium, Australia has comparative advantages in nuclear that should be seen as an opportunity, not a threat. Similarly, we should take advantage of the surge in demand for critical minerals from our allies by getting those fundamentals right. The Quad, Five Eyes, AUKUS all offer opportunities for Australia's resource industry to be a critical enabler of supply chain sovereignty for our allies. We'll explore reforms that capitalise on trade agreements and further streamline our foreign investment rules with our most trusted allies to support our resources and manufacturing industries. We've seen three Labor budgets that have tried to have it both ways. Increasing spending while claiming to bring inflation down. Increasing taxes while claiming that families are better off. Increasing red and green tape while claiming businesses will invest more. From now until the election, you will see our relentless focus on getting Australia back on track by focusing on getting the basics right. This does mean a back-to-basics economic plan, fighting high prices and interest rates first, winding back regulatory roadblocks, delivering lower, simpler and fairer taxes and restoring the dream of home ownership. In the last 2 years, we've been prepared to take policy positions that are not easy, but are right. We will provide a real choice and a real contrast. We did it on The Voice. We are doing it with our plans on next-generation nuclear power. We are talking about productivity again because we have to. It's not merely about choosing a different government. It's about choosing a different future. A future where fairness, opportunity, enterprise and prosperity are within reach of all Australians, not just the select few who are aligned to the Labor Party. One that restores hope and confidence in our economy, our country and its great potential. This is what these uncertain economic times demand. This is what Australians need. Australians can't afford another 3 years of Labor.
Well, thanks, Angus. If I could take up a couple of things you have highlighted in the speech. One was you said that Labor had basically had produced low growth, that it had only been fuelled by population growth. You've highlighted a per capita recession since that time. Again, and also you talked about the net overseas migration numbers now being about 1.6 million. The last figure for a 5-year period before the pandemic interrupted things was actually 1.3, I think it's 1.35. So it's not that different over a 5-year period now, considering the surge we had post-COVID. On that basis, could you confirm that the Coalition's position is that you would be looking to get the net overseas migration number down to 160,000, And if that's the case, doesn't that imply from your own analysis that we wouldn't just be looking at a per capita recession, we'd be looking at an actual recession?
Well, a couple of comments I'd make about this, and it's a very good question, Laura, an important question. The reason we've got a GDP per capita recession is the country is going backwards. Productivity has collapsed in an unprecedented way, as I said in my speech, over 6%. We haven't seen that before. And that is weighing heavily on the ability of businesses to pass on increases in real wages. I mean, it's all well and good to have increases in nominal wages, but it's what's in your pay packet that counts. And as long as productivity has collapsed the way it has, then it's very hard to see a pathway without being in a GDP per capita recession, which is a situation we have. And it's GDP per person that counts. This is the crucial point. If you're in a household, GDP per person is the thing that affects your prosperity. And so that's why we put so much focus on it. We're absolutely not against immigration, as I said in my speech. I mean, we're a proud immigrant nation, and as you pointed out, we had sensible levels of immigration when we were in power. But those numbers have got out of control. It's 1.67, by the way, is the latest number, and you've got to remember every number Labor gives us goes up. They try to spin it. The MyEFO, they said, oh, you know, our forecasts are changed and we're going to cut on the forecasts. They went up and they keep going up. So who knows where they're going to end up. In answer to your question about NOM, we've said over the coming years we'll achieve a 25% reduction in the NOM versus what Labor has.
I think that was the permanent migration number.
And the NOM. And so that's a reasonable number for, we think, to achieve. Permanent migration is part of that. So too, as I said in the speech, is making sure that we've got a sensible level of international students. And, you know, it's an important sector and we want to see it continue to prosper. But we've seen those numbers get to levels they never were at prior to COVID. There's been a massive escalation in those numbers in the last couple of years. And we think we can achieve a NOM, that's the net migration in Australia, which is consistent with a level of housing supply that is realistic. You can't move housing supply overnight, and so you've got to bring those two numbers into line.
Sorry, so just to confirm, you're saying a 25% cut in the net overseas migration rate?
That's right.
Thanks. Mark Riley.
That's what we call a story. Mr Taylor, Mark Riley from the 7 Network, thank you very much for your address and taking our questions today, much appreciated. I want to ask you about, again today you've rejected the production tax credits in the budget as corporate welfare, but before and during the 2022 election, you as Energy Minister promised about $1.5 billion in upfront handouts to many of the very same projects. Just having a look at them now, there were $800 million to hydrogen hubs, $500 million to critical minerals projects. Isn't it hypocritical now to reject production tax credits on the basis of having promised upfront subsidies and handouts only a couple of years ago to the same projects?
Well, Mark, thank you for the question, but we never promised production tax credits. I mean, that's for an operating business. Our focus was on R&D. It was on the front end of research and development to get technologies that are still in reasonably early stages to a point where they can be run commercially and profitably by businesses making commercial profitable investments. Government has always had a role in R&D. But that's not what we're talking about here with production tax credits. This is a subsidy for every unit of production. I mean, if I walked out this door now, or said to you now, we're going to give $1 to every cafe owner for every coffee they produce, that's a production tax credit. But I don't think the cafes of Australia expect that. They know they've got to produce a great product for great customers that their customers want to pay for, and from which they can make a profit. And that's what we should expect from businesses in Australia. And, you know, the broader point here is this. You know, I'm a huge believer in our manufacturing and resources sector. As I said, you know, it's a sector I worked in for many years before politics, but I know that it succeeds because you get the fundamentals right. It succeeds because you get your approvals right. You get red tape out of the way. You make sure your industrial relations laws are good for both employee and employer. All of those things are necessary, and frankly, they're the key to making it succeed. You don't get any production tax credits if there's no production, and the key is to help these companies to succeed by getting the fundamentals right.
Dana Daniel.
Dana Daniel from the Canberra Times. Thank you for your speech. You've said the government is wasting money on a bloated public service with 36,000 new roles. Where do you see the greatest fat in the public service that the coalition would look to cut back? Would you bring back the APS cap, and would you decentralise the public service by moving agencies out of Canberra to the regions or other cities?
Yep. Now, all good questions, and be patient. So, more detail on those numbers will be forthcoming. But the important point here is this: we don't think now is the time to add 36,000 Commonwealth public servants. There's not many Australian businesses who are able to, who are the taxpayers, of course, and Australian households who are able to expand in that kind of way. And we think just as Australian households and businesses are having to show frugality, are having to make ends meet, so too should the Commonwealth Government. Peter Dutton has already made some comments about how we would see some reallocation of those numbers towards national security roles and defence roles. But the important point here is now is not the time to expand government. Now is the time to make sure government lives within its means, so that households don't have to do the hard work for government, because ultimately it's households and businesses that pay the taxes that pay for those public servants.
Phil Curry.
Thanks, Mr Taylor. Just ask about taxation. You've already said before this speech today you'd look at what you could afford to do on income tax closer to the election within the spirit of Stage 3. You've said today you've noted our highest company tax rates, and you've said the extension of the instant asset write-off is a down payment. Yep. Could I take that to mean that your medium-term plans will include another examination of the company tax rate or other business taxes? And just in continuation with your low tax philosophy, how do you reconcile that with your pledge to get the budget back into structural surplus, especially if you're going to put that 23.9% speed limit back on? So,
a number of questions in there, Phil, all good questions. Of course, one of them is asking me, as you always do, to announce additional policy to what we've already announced today, which I won't do. But I will say, you talked about my comment about company taxes. I mean, this is why accelerated depreciation is so powerful. You know, it is an unbelievably effective way to drive productivity, growth, job creation, risk-taking that you desperately need in the economy, and the small business sector is crucial to doing that. And so Labor has refused to reinstate accelerated depreciation back to where it was prior to COVID. They're looking for all sorts of excuses on that, but they haven't done it. We think that does need to be reinstated, but more than that, we think it needs to be a permanent part of our tax regime, which will help small businesses to make those investments and have incentives to do it. The other point I would make about your overall comments is, you know, the best way to beat bracket creep is to have lower inflation. Now, the reason personal income taxes have gone up by 23%. I mean, it's a stunning number. A very small part of that is population growth, by the way, in total. It's 23%. The vast majority of that is inflation-driven. If you want to get personal income taxes down and stop them creeping away like a thief in the night, you've got to get inflation down. Governments do well out of high inflation. This government has done well out of high inflation, but households don't. Effectively, what our tax system does is take from households and gives to the government. And our philosophy is very different. To your point about how do you make sure that you can deliver lower taxes and structural balance over time, you make sure the economy grows faster than you're spending. It is a very simple formula. It has worked for a long time, and it's a formula that this government has ditched. And we see in the next 2 years going to a big structural deficit and a 16% increase in spending in just 2 years.
And could I just clarify, chasing up Phil's question, are you perpetually wedded to 23.9% GDP for...
Yeah, that's the tax GDP. That's the tax GDP.
Which is
so
just
it's
a
about...
made-up number, but just a made-up number.
Well, some might say that, but it's been around for a while, Laura, and
Yes.
you've got to pick a number that you think. Well, the science here is that if you grow the economy faster than you're spending, your budget position is constantly improving, and that can do two things. One, it can strengthen your budget position, and secondly, it can help to support maintaining tax to GDP at a level which is sustainable over the medium to longer term, and we want to do both.
Tom Connell.
Tom Connell from Sky News. Casting my mind back to the last time the Coalition won office when Labor was in power, and similarities with the Coalition narrative, if you like, wasteful Labor spending that the Coalition would end. It's fair to say when you got to power, that first budget still seemed to take a few people by surprise, though, in terms of the spending cuts. So I'm just wondering your approach this time around. Will you be really detailed if you win power and then you hand out your first budget or hand down your first budget? There won't be major surprises in terms of spending cuts you've suddenly had to find?
Well, we plan to announce our policies before the election, like Anthony Albanese, who's announced many of them, particularly in the tax area, since the election, whether it's franking credits or indeed the stage 3 tax cuts and so on. He's done much of that since the election and continues to, and we'll see how much more of that there is. Superannuation is another example of that, so we do plan to. But the key to this, and we realised this, I think, during our last term of government, Matthias Cormann and other finance ministers and treasurers focused on it relentlessly. You've got to make sure your economy grows faster than your spending, Tom. That doesn't mean scorched earth. It means restraint. It means there's discipline on colleagues. What I see in Labor right now is those disciplines are not there. They're not there. I mean, every minister will always have an idea about something they could spend money on, but there has to be restraint, just as there's restraint right now in households and businesses across Australia. And to do that, you've got to have simple rules, which we did drive and succeed in delivering in that period leading up to COVID. So that's the key. That's the key, and that's why bringing back that fiscal rule is so important. It gives Australian taxpayers certainty, it gives all Australians certainty, but it also creates a discipline within government, which I think is crucially important.
No scorched earth, meaning it'll happen slowly?
But it's restraint. I mean, it's sensible here. This is about making sure that you grow the economy faster than you're spending. It's like every business person in Australia has to have a rule something like that to make sure that there's a fair deal there for shareholders as well as employees and customers. And this is just sensible, back to basic stuff. There's nothing shiny and new about it, but it's been ditched by the government. This is the point. They've given up the ghost on this stuff. They've put up the white flag, and that's why you see this 16% increase in spending in 2 years.
David Spears.
David Spears from the ABC. Angus, thank you for your speech. I was going to ask you about nuclear policy, but I think I need to clear up migration. You've said a 25% reduction in the net overseas migration intake is the Coalition's policy. Peter Dutton has said he'd reduce it from 260 to 160,000 next year. That's more than 25%.
Yeah, but that's over. I'm talking about over the 4 years, David. So look, the position here is this. Well, Peter's already given you, as you know, the permanent migration numbers and the overall numbers over the next couple of years. Over the coming years, there'll be, a term of government, there'll be 25% reduction. So that's the plan. If our policies, of course, were implemented tomorrow, or if they'd been indeed implemented when Labor came to power, we'd have seen many more houses freed up and a much better balance between housing and migration. But that's the balance that we're seeking to achieve, and that's where the 100,000 houses, will.
Okay, just to be clear though, on net overseas migration. Yeah. Is it a 25% reduction next year or not?
No, I said over the full term of government.
Over 3 years?
Over 3.
A 25% reduction. Okay, and that was a settled Coalition position?
No, I've already said that, David. I've already said that. By the way, delighted to get your question. I thought you'd asked me enough questions last Sunday, but it's good to see you back at the microphone.
Charles Croucher.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I'll ask about nuclear then. This week, David Littleproud was asked, would there be a nuclear power plant in the Northern Territory? His response was the Northern Territory's role will be gas, gas and more gas. Mm-hmm. Since we're ruling places in and out, can you tell me, will there be a nuclear power plant in New South Wales?
Yeah, you're a bit like Phil. You're always looking for an opportunity to get us to announce another policy beyond what we already have. We've been very clear on this. We see nuclear as part of the future of our energy system in Australia. It's because we're going to lose 90% of our base load. Gas obviously has to play an important role in the meantime. We're delighted to see that the government has shown, in a rhetorical sense, some interest in gas again, but we've seen no substance behind that. We certainly haven't seen the National Gas Infrastructure Plan being reinstated. That will play a role for some time, for many years, but longer term, nuclear, which is zero emissions technology, of course, we think can play an important role in providing that baseload power. We've been very clear that the principle here is to focus on sites that are on or near current existing coal-fired generators that will close, and that's the 90% that's closing over the years coming through to 2035, they're the obvious sites. And the important reason for this is that it means that you've got substantial costs that are otherwise necessary that won't be necessary. I mean, the Labor plan right now is to wrap this country in transmission lines. And those of us who live in regional Australia understand the impact of that. But there's also broader impacts, like I talked about, of taking people out of construction trades who we need to be building houses and doing other things and putting them into transmission lines that we already have. We already have, Charles. And so this is why it's such an important policy. We've laid out the principles around the sites, and we'll obviously have more to say. There's a lot in this policy, but it's a big shift, and I would say it's the most profound shift in energy policy in my lifetime, and so it's why we're working through it meticulously. And as I say, Ted and Peter and others will have more to say in the coming months.
Patrick Commons. David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mr Taylor, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Nuclear is in the news today. There's a report from CSIRO and from AEMO, the market operator, about the cost of nuclear power stations. It puts that cost at anywhere from $8.56 to maybe $16, $17 billion for the first nuclear power station. Now, in that scenario, first, what's your response to that CSIRO analysis? But I think fundamentally, do you accept that a coalition government, to make nuclear happen, has to offer subsidies to make that happen? How big are the subsidies that you're willing to offer as a future treasurer, perhaps, to a nuclear industry in Australia?
You know, David, let me make a couple of points about this. The first is this. Lots of people bandy numbers around nuclear and other energy sources. I mean, ultimately, the numbers that I take the most notice of are the ones that people invest in and investors focus on. But there's all sorts of assumptions that go into numbers. One of them is how much transmission you avoid by building a generator on or near an existing site, and that's a really important consideration in the economics of all this. A second one is the utilisation of the generator, and of course many people like to make assumptions that you'd build a baseload generator but not use it as baseload. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but a lot of people like to make those assumptions. So there's all sorts of assumptions that get them to those numbers. The key for me, as someone who really believes that we should make sure that we have affordable, reliable power, and I don't want to commit subsidies that aren't necessary is to make sure that it's commercially viable, and we think it can be. And Ted will have more to say about this. Peter will have more to say about this in the coming months. If it's commercially viable, it's not going to be subsidies. It's as simple as that, David. That's how the commercial world works. And
I can't question that assumption because you've prefaced your sentence with the word if. If it's commercially viable, it won't.
No, I said it can be.
It won't need subsidies.
No, I think it can be commercially viable. This is the point. And you've got to look very hard at the way we're thinking about this. If you use existing sites, you avoid much of the cost that would otherwise be necessary, and much of the cost that's being committed to by this government in order to move electrons around. If you focus on existing sites, it makes a very substantial difference. But you've also got to focus on baseload power. I mean, this is the point. We're going to lose 90% over the next 10 years. And this government does not have a feasible plan to achieve that. 90%. It is baseload power that's leaving the system, and that's power that will run the vast majority of the time.
Patrick Commons this time.
Thanks very much for your speech, Mr Taylor. It's Patrick Commons from the Australian newspaper. You talked about the never-ending bracket creep, and you said the best way to beat bracket creep is through lower inflation. There's another way to beat bracket creep, and it's a way that's been proposed by Westpac's chief economist, Lucy Ellis, and that is to index the income tax thresholds, maybe to the middle of where the RBA targets inflation, about 2.5%. Now, isn't that a better way to address bracket creep, so we don't have to keep revisiting the tax scales and go through these fights each time? Are you open to indexing the income tax thresholds to address bracket creep if you were to take government?
Well, thanks for the question, Pat. Of course, the other way to do it is to flatten thresholds. And that is exactly what we proposed in the Stage 3 tax cuts that this government, this Treasurer and Prime Minister promised over 100 times they were going to stick with. They voted for it. They went to an election supporting that, and then after the election they decided their policy was different, and that would have actually taken out substantial bracket creep. So there's many ways to achieve this, and we were disappointed that they didn't continue with that big tax bracket. They've spent the money, of course, in a different way, but the truth is that was the whole part of the purpose of those 3 stages of tax cuts, not just stage 3, stage 1, 2 and 3, was to substantially reduce the impact of bracket creep. This government appears to love bracket creep. That's why I think they were so keen to get another tax bracket in, and that's exactly what they've done. And the reason why they love bracket creep is because it fills their coffers. Now, inflation fills government's coffers. It drains households' coffers. It drains businesses' coffers, but it fills government's coffers. And so the government has pursued the path it has. The first port of call is to put downward pressure on inflation, as I say, and that's our highest priority, but we'll have more to say about broader tax reform over the coming months, obviously.
Jason Koutsoukis.
Mr Taylor, thanks for your speech. Jason Koutsoukis from the Saturday paper. In September 2022, after the permanent migration intake was increased to a record 195,000 a year, Peter Dutton said it was too little, too late, adding that it's clear that the number needs to be higher. Why do you think he said that?
Well, I don't think anyone understood at that time the degree to which labour productivity in this country could have collapsed so badly and not come back, and it hasn't. This is the point. It's very simple maths. If you have a labour productivity collapse of 6.5%, you need to have 6.5% more labour to be able to produce the same amount as you did before that labour productivity collapse. Now, our hope is that the government will actually try to fix that. They've shown no pathway to do it, but what I've laid out in my speech is a pathway to fix that problem. And that's why we think we can balance a more sustainable level of immigration with making sure that we're dealing with those skill shortages Australians are seeing, and have seen in the past. We do think that balance is absolutely achievable, but the key to it is to get productivity back into balance, and it hasn't been under this government.
Poppy Johnson.
Thank you for your speech. Poppy Johnson from AAP. I was hoping you could address a critique of the super for housing policy, that people most in need of help to get onto the property ladder don't have enough super to help them buy, and so it will help wealthier home buyers. What do you say to that?
Sorry, can you just repeat that last part of the question? I missed it. Poppy.
Oh, that people most in need of help won't have enough super in their accounts.
Yes.
And it will be more likely to benefit people with more in their super who are wealthier.
Yeah. Well, look, we think Australians deserve the opportunity to use their super for every possible investment that's available. And right now you've got a situation where Australians can invest in anyone's home except their own. That's the truth of what we've got at the moment in front of us in the current situation, and we think it's absolutely appropriate for those who have got super in their account to be able to use that for their own home as well. They've still got to put it back in. It's still part of their accumulating pool of assets that they'll use in retirement. And the crucial point here is we know that the best indicator of a good retirement is going into retirement owning your home. So we do think it's important. It's not going to be the answer for everyone, which is to your point, but it will be the answer for many, and it's why we continue to support it, and it's why we consider owning your own home as absolutely central to the Australian aspiration and the Australian dream, and we think this is part of the answer.
Katina Curtis.
Thanks. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. I just want to take you back to the net overseas migration number. I think there's a lot of scribbling and calculations going on. So on your answer before, you said you're looking at a 25% reduction over the term, the estimates on the term of the next government. So that would give me an average of 181,250 NOM each year. So is it a 25% reduction, or is it 160,000, as Peter Dutton has said? And would you guarantee that Australia would still have a $50 billion education export industry?
Yeah, so answer to those two questions separately. To your first question, I think I've already answered it, so I'm not going to add to that. I've already given you the answer to the question.
But what you've said is different to what your leader has said.
But no, it's not. It's not different. I mean, you don't confuse permanent migration and NOM and the time frames and
he said 160,000 in the NOM.
But I've been very clear about where we sit on this. The second question, which was,
do you guarantee Australia will still have a $50 billion international education sector?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've still got a big international education sector. I'm not going to predict what its revenues are going to be. That's driven by all sorts of things, including how much they charge for each student that comes to a university or college or vocational education. But what I am going to say is that we'll continue to have a successful sector. But we did see, we have seen in the couple of years since COVID, a huge increase in those numbers. It's got to be sustainable. But we want it to be sustainable at a level which can work for those educational institutions, but also works for Australian students. I mean, if that number gets out of kilter, then the truth is the educational experience for Australians goes backwards. We've seen some of that right now, and we need to get the balance right. And what we're suggesting is, and we'll again have more to say about this in the coming months, that getting that balance right has got to be a real focus of the government's policy, and it's certainly a focus for us.
Ben Westcott.
Sorry for the dead air. Thank you so much for your speech, Shadow Treasurer. I really appreciate it. I just want to take you to the cuts so the government in your first year of office in 2 years' time, if you win the election, it's a $40 billion deficit or something like that. Now, so far you've spoken about a number of cuts you want to make to what Labor's promised at this election. Most of them are in the millions, though. The exception is the billions in corporate welfare. Now, that's only $300 million in that year. Most of that's backloaded to the never, never. And then there's the government, the public servant spots as well, which is about $6 billion or something like that. So that leaves about $34 billion or something like that. What sort of cuts are you thinking about making there? How are you going to bring that down?
Well, I think I've laid out a very clear picture for the overall goal, which is that you've got to make sure your spending grows faster, or your growth grows faster than your spending. Your economic growth is faster than your spending growth. And it's such a common sense rule, because you know then you're always improving your budget position and you're able to give money back in lower taxes over time. So it's pretty simple. You're missing some significant numbers in all of that, by the way. $45 billion that we've opposed through the Parliament, $18 billion of interest payments attached to that, and that's very significant, and it includes much of the power line expenditure that I think is unnecessary if you get your energy policy right. So, and you know, the important point here is this is restraint. This is just sensible restraint. It's not some kind of scorched earth policy. It doesn't need to be. We saw that when we were last in government. If you have sensible restraint, it means that you can do things like pass through tax cuts, stages 1, 2 and 3. That was our focus in government, and we'll have a very similar focus when in government again.
Paul Carp.
Thanks very much. The GenCost report shows large-scale nuclear would cost $141 a megawatt hour, compared with $80 to $130 for solar and wind, and that includes the cost of firming renewables and the cost of transmission. So just picking up on David Crow's question, what exactly are you doing differently to the CSIRO to bridge that gap? And will the coalition possibly be reviving the national energy guarantee so that the reliability of nuclear is priced in?
Well, can I make a couple of points about that? The reliability piece of the national energy guarantee was actually implemented. I was the minister when we did it, and I realised that we had to go further and we had to establish a capacity mechanism, which this government has pursued, but said it should be renewables only. Now, we're the only country in the world that I'm aware of that's done that. A renewables only strategy, I think, doesn't work for dispatchable firm power. You're not going to get there, and it's why we've been very clear that you've got to have enough dispatchability in your system. That's why you've got to have, alongside the renewables, which will continue to see investment, particularly household solar, you've got to have investment in gas. You've got to have a longer-term baseload source. In terms of your numbers, look, as I said, I think I answered that question earlier. A lot of people bandy around a lot of numbers. There's a lot of assumptions that go into those numbers, of course, and some of which we can agree with, some of which we may not. The important point here is that I'm firmly convinced that nuclear can generate a return, because this system needs baseload power, and you can get a reasonable return from having good, clean, zero-emission baseload power. And I think the economics, as you'll see in the coming months, the economics can work.
Do you accept that the renewables
at an affordable price,
firming and transmission? The GenCost report includes firming and transmission for renewables, and it's still cheaper.
Well, there's lots of other assumptions in the GenCost as well, so we can sit and get technical about this now, and I'm not going to do that. But there's lots of other assumptions in a GenCost report that you know, we can sit and argue all day. What I am convinced of is that this can be a source of baseload power, high utilisation power in our system, which is zero emissions, which can be affordable, and which can deliver the necessary return.
We're getting close to the end of our broadcast time, but are you happy to take a few more questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks. Pablo.
Thank you. Pablo Vinales from SBS. Mr. Taylor, nurses and aged care workers make up some of the biggest cohorts of skilled migrants coming to Australia. So under your proposal to cut migration, is it not the case that you would have to reduce the intake of these workers in order to allow construction workers to come in and build the houses that Australia needs?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into the allocation of those visas across different groups today. Now is not the appropriate time. What I would say is it's still a very significant number, and so it can deal with the needs that we have. The broader point I'd make, though, and this doesn't apply to any particular occupation, this applies across the board, is if you get labour productivity back on track, if you increase participation rates, like getting pensioners and veterans, giving them more of an incentive into the workforce, you can actually alleviate those pressures in other ways. And we think it is absolutely feasible to alleviate those pressures in a whole range of different ways. But it does mean doing something this government is not doing, which is making sure that our workplaces are competitive, productive, good for employees as well as employers, and that hasn't been the focus of the government.
Jack Quayle.
Thank you very much, Mr Taylor, for your address. Jack Quayle from the News Corp Wire. You've spoken in your address about unwinding the worst of Labor's workplace laws. Beyond the right to disconnect and the changes to the definition of casual employment, I mean, what are the worst? What constitutes the worst of Labor's workplace laws? Are they multi-employer bargaining, the clampdown on labour hire we saw earlier this year, changes to the gig economy? What do you see as those worst laws?
And another cheeky attempt to get me to announce more policies than we've already announced over the last little while. But I mean, the casual one, which I outlined in my speech and Peter outlined as well last Thursday night, I think is one that we believe gets the balance wrong between the flexibility so many people are looking for in the workplace. That flexibility is way more valued than it was in the past. What the reasons are for that, maybe COVID, there's other drivers. More families where both are working, so they want more flexibility to be able to deal with that. And that's why we think what Labor's done in the area of casuals is taking us backwards and is not helping to get what we really want, which is employees being able to be paid more, getting more purchasing power out of their pay packets, employers having productive, competitive workplaces so that they can succeed as businesses, and that will continue to be our focus. Michaela Cash, it's good to see her here over from WA, and Michaela, of course, will talk more about these issues in the coming months, but I think the casuals point is one that is enormously important, and like many of Labor's steps, are a backward step in terms of getting the prosperity, rising real wages that we all want to see.
Finn McHugh.
Hi, Mr Taylor. Finn McHugh from Capital Brief. In March, Peter Dutton said that we could expect more details on the nuclear policy very shortly. Obviously, the budget reply was an obvious point to put a bit more meat on the bone. I get, you don't want to announce any policy today, but given how significant it is, what kind of time frame are we looking at for a fully costed plan that Australians can vote on?
Well, can I just say, as I said a little earlier, this is one of the most profound changes of direction in energy policy in this country, certainly in my lifetime. Hugely important. It is about making sure we've got an affordable, reliable, sustainable energy grid for decades to come, and making sure we've got a pathway that's achievable, not a pathway that's going to take us in the wrong direction. And that's why we're announcing it in a staged way. We've laid out many of the principles, and Ted O'Brien will continue to do that. I'm not going to give you the date of all our announcements between now and the next election, but can I assure you of one thing? We will announce our policies before the election, not afterwards. And we were unbelievably disappointed to see this Labor government make a series of announcements about what its policies were before the election and then change their mind afterwards. Our focus is on consistent policies before and after the election.
Unlike 2014. Melissa Code.
Hi, Mr Taylor. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Apologies if this question sounds contrarian, but I think it's an important question to put to you. You mentioned before the importance of government spending within its means when it comes to resourcing the Australian public service. And when Labor approached the last election, one of its election mandates was making the APS fit for purpose. Given the budget references some really essential things like clearing backlog for Veteran Affairs compensation and also Services Australia backlog of like 500,000 claims, what is the Coalition's view on adequately resourcing the APS if not resourcing it properly might lead to really consequential issues that come up in major royal commissions further down the track, costing the government and society even more?
Yeah, I mean, there's areas where it's clear that backlogs have needed to be cleared. We were very conscious of that in government on veterans in particular, where we upped that resourcing in the final budget, because we did feel that needed to be cleared, and that was an important initiative. We also think that it's more important that we put Canberra-based or Canberra public servants and bureaucrats more generally focused on national security concerns, and Peter laid that out in his speech. Defence, of course, is one of those areas, and you know, this is all about where your priorities are. We do think that it is important to have the right resourcing for veterans in particular. That's one we're very conscious of.
So it's not the case the Coalition is anti-fit-for-purpose public service?
No, of course not. I mean, I've worked with the public service for many, many years as a minister, and I know there's enormous capability within the public service. But like every part of Australia, every household, every business, we've got to live within our means. We've got to achieve the best possible outcomes with the resources we have, and that's important for the public sector as it is for the private sector and households. And you know, this is just sensible stuff. It's how most Australians have to live their lives, and it shouldn't be any different for Canberra-based public servants as it is for anyone else.
Andrew Probyn.
Mr Taylor, Andrew Probyn, 9 News. Look, at risk of really annoying you, would you spell out exactly what your policy is on net overseas migration? Because there seems to be quite a bit of confusion driven by the fact that your numbers don't seem to stack up with Peter Dutton's.
Well, I don't agree with that, and I've laid them out. And,
well, can
and
you lay them out again?
So Probes, I've already answered that question. I'm not going to answer it again, and I've been very clear about it, and I'll leave it to you to make the commentary. But you know, our position is clear. Look, at the end of the day, we think we can free up 100,000 homes for Australians, and it's not very hard to work out the calculations on the NOM that have got to support that. So I'll leave you guys to the commentary. But the crucial point is this: we want to see Australians being able to get back into a home again when that's their aspiration. And we see a whole generation of younger Australians who are losing that aspiration. They can't see a pathway to own a home. And one of the important levers, is not the only one, but one of the important levers to achieve that is to make sure we have an immigration rate, a net overseas migration rate, to use the technical jargon, that is consistent with what our housing sector can build. And that's what this policy is all about, and that's how the 100,000 has come about. We would strongly encourage the government to implement the policies that we've outlined tomorrow, and that number can be substantially higher. So that's where it sits, Probes, and I think it's pretty straightforward. You free up houses because your net overseas migration is lower, and I've laid that out.
Finally, Chair's prerogative, if you wouldn't mind. Now, you're saying that you'll also be stopping foreign investors from buying established housing. There are only 1,339 established dwellings with the last data we've got available bought by foreign investors. On that basis, why wouldn't you stop domestic investors buying established homes, given that they bought 172,000 established dwellings in that same year? Why not scrap negative gearing and reduce the capital gains tax for investors in established dwellings?
Well, you know, I realise that the Labor Party and the union movement have a vision of housing ownership and rental in this country where the unions own the housing stock, not small Australian businesses, plumbers and chippies and electricians, who, of course, are now in a position where they can buy a block or buy a home and use their skills to add value to it. And that's how our system works. And then they rent that out. Ultimately, they might live in it as well, but they rent that out. And we think that's a good model. We don't think that's the right thing to change. And foreign investment is a very different thing. I mean, those chippies and electricians and plumbers already live in this country. And it's a very big difference between those two things. But we don't share Labor's vision of big union-owned housing, renting that housing out to Australians who want to rent. We just don't think that is the pathway forward, but that's the pathway we know Labor wants to pursue with those policies.
Well, you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you, and please thank Angus Taylor for speaking.
Thank you.